Remember those cooking tricks only in Betty Crocker's cookbooks that made life easier? They helped turn busy days into tasty wins with simple, clever hacks. So why did these kitchen secrets slip through the cracks? Using a meat thermometer properly was one of those cooking tricks that made a huge difference in mid-century kitchens, reflecting a growing emphasis on food safety and perfect results. Home cooks were taught to use the thermometer to check the internal temperature of roasts and poultry, ensuring meats were cooked thoroughly without overcooking. This simple tool helped avoid underdone meat, which could be unsafe, and overcooked dishes that became dry and tough. Betty Crocker's cookbooks provided clear instructions on how to insert the thermometer correctly and what temperatures to aim for, helping even novice cooks achieve professional results. This technique empowered home chefs to serve meats confidently, impressing family and guests alike. Using a meat thermometer became a standard practice in American kitchens during that era, demonstrating the increasing availability of kitchen gadgets aimed at improving cooking outcomes. It was a step toward modern cooking, balancing tradition with technology. The emphasis on accuracy and safety embodied the post-war desire for reliability in everyday meals and contributed to the rise of more sophisticated home cooking. Soaking celery stalks in ice water was a simple yet effective trick that Betty Crocker's cookbooks shared to restore crispness to vegetables for salads and garnishes. This method involved placing celery stalks in a bowl of cold water with plenty of ice, allowing the vegetable to rehydrate and regain its fresh crunchiness. The trick was perfect for rescuing limp or slightly wilted celery, making it appealing for use in dishes where texture was key. Crisp celery elevated salads by adding a satisfying bite and fresh flavor, enhancing the overall eating experience. This quick fix was practical and required minimal effort, fitting well with the era's emphasis on efficient, economical cooking. It reflected the mid-century homemaker's desire to reduce waste and get the most out of ingredients. Soaking vegetables in ice water became a common household practice, proving that small kitchen habits could make a big difference in food quality. The trick remains a classic for anyone wanting to revive fresh produce and keep meals crisp and enjoyable. Using gelatin to stabilize whipped cream was a secret weapon in Betty Crocker's cookbooks for home cooks who wanted their desserts to look perfect longer. This trick involved adding a small amount of dissolved gelatin to freshly whipped cream, helping it hold its shape without collapsing or melting quickly. The result was a firmer, more stable whipped topping that maintained its fluffy texture on cakes, pies, and other desserts during serving. This was especially valuable for celebrations or gatherings where presentation mattered and desserts needed to last. The method gave home bakers a professional edge, allowing them to serve show-stopping dishes with confidence. It also minimized the frustration of whipped cream melting too fast in warm environments. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this tip reflected the growing sophistication in home baking and the importance placed on aesthetics. This trick helped bridge the gap between simple home desserts and bakery-quality presentations, encouraging creativity and pride in homemade sweets. Reheating mashed potatoes with milk and butter was a practical tip from Betty Crocker's cookbooks that helped restore the creamy texture and rich flavor of leftover potatoes. Instead of drying out when reheated, adding a splash of milk and a pat of butter allowed the mashed potatoes to regain their smoothness and moisture. This technique turned a potentially dull leftover into a dish that tasted freshly made, making it more appealing to eat again. It was especially useful during busy weeks when preparing new meals was challenging, but enjoying comfort food was still desired. The method was simple and accessible, requiring only basic dairy staples found in most kitchens. Betty Crocker's advice demonstrated a thoughtful approach to reducing waste and enhancing leftovers, reflecting mid-century household priorities. This reheating trick remains popular among cooks who appreciate quick fixes that do not sacrifice taste or quality. It shows how small adjustments can bring warmth and satisfaction to everyday meals. How to make fluffy pancakes using seltzer water was a unique approach Betty Crocker's cookbooks promoted to achieve lighter, airier pancakes without relying solely on traditional leavening agents. The trick involved substituting or adding seltzer water to the batter, introducing bubbles that helped create a delicate texture when cooked. This method resulted in pancakes that were tender and soft with a pleasing rise, delighting families at breakfast tables. It also allowed cooks to experiment with ingredients and achieve better consistency in their pancakes. The use of seltzer reflected the mid-century interest in innovative techniques that improved classic recipes while keeping preparation straightforward. This approach was especially valuable for those looking to make pancakes fluffier without extra baking powder or soda. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this trick showed a balance between tradition and culinary science, making cooking fun and accessible. It remains a clever tip for pancake lovers seeking to perfect their morning meal with a light touch. Preventing brown sugar from hardening by adding a slice of bread was a classic pantry hack recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to keep this essential ingredient soft and easy to use. Brown sugar naturally tends to dry out and clump when exposed to air, making it difficult to scoop and measure. Placing a small piece of fresh bread in the container created a humid environment that helped maintain moisture in the sugar, preventing it from hardening. This simple yet effective trick saved time and frustration in the kitchen, especially for recipes requiring smooth brown sugar. It was a practical solution embraced by mid-century cooks who valued convenience and resourcefulness. The hack minimized waste and kept baking processes running smoothly. Betty Crocker's advice highlighted attention to detail in everyday cooking, reinforcing the importance of small habits that improved kitchen efficiency. This trick continues to be widely used by bakers seeking to preserve the quality of their brown sugar. Separating eggs with a plastic bottle was a clever, no-mess trick that Betty Crocker's cookbook shared to help home cooks quickly separate yolks from whites without special tools. The method involved squeezing a clean plastic bottle to create suction, and then gently releasing it near the yolk, which would be drawn up into the bottle, leaving the whites behind. This technique minimized mess, reduced the risk of breaking yolks, and required no additional utensils, making it accessible to cooks of all skill levels. It was especially helpful in recipes that called for multiple separated eggs, saving time and effort. The trick reflected mid-century America's practical mindset, emphasizing innovative yet simple ways to streamline cooking tasks. Betty Crocker's promotion of this hack encouraged experimentation and confidence in the kitchen. The plastic bottle method remains popular today for its ease and effectiveness, illustrating timeless cooking wisdom passed down through generations. Browning ground meat in small batches for better flavor was a technique Betty Crocker's cookbooks recommended to home cooks aiming for evenly cooked, richly flavored dishes. Cooking smaller amounts at a time allowed the meat to brown properly rather than steam, enhancing its taste and texture. This method prevented overcrowding the pan, which can cause the meat to release moisture and become soggy. The resulting browned meat developed a deeper color and more complex flavors, making it ideal for sauces, casseroles, and skillet meals. This cooking trick was valued in mid-century kitchens for producing superior results with common ingredients like ground beef or pork. Betty Crocker's detailed guidance on this technique reflected the growing culinary knowledge shared with home cooks to elevate everyday meals. Taking the extra time to brown meat in batches showed an investment in flavor that distinguished home-cooked dishes. This approach continues to be a fundamental principle for achieving delicious and well-textured meals. Using mayonnaise to keep meatloaf moist was an unexpected ingredient tip that Betty Crocker's cookbooks offered to ensure tender, juicy results in this classic dish. Incorporating mayonnaise into the meat mixture added fat and moisture, preventing the meatloaf from drying out during baking. This simple addition helped maintain a soft texture, enhancing the overall eating experience. The trick was especially helpful in times when leaner cuts of meat were used or when cooks wanted to stretch ingredients without sacrificing quality. Betty Crocker's advice reflected an understanding of ingredient functionality and an innovative approach to improving traditional recipes. This method contributed to meatloaf's reputation as a comforting, reliable meal that families could enjoy regularly. Using mayonnaise in meatloaf demonstrated the mid-century home cook's creativity and willingness to experiment with familiar pantry items. It remains a popular secret for achieving the perfect meatloaf today. Softening stale bread with a damp paper towel and microwave was a quick fix promoted in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to restore freshness without baking. This technique involved wrapping the bread loosely in a damp paper towel and microwaving it for short intervals, creating steam that softened the crust and crumb. The method revived the bread's texture, making it more palatable for sandwiches or toast. It was a practical solution embraced by mid-century cooks to reduce waste and extend the usability of leftover bread. This trick saved time and energy compared to reheating in an oven and was particularly useful for small quantities. Betty Crocker's recommendation of this hack showcased the era's focus on efficiency and resourcefulness in the kitchen. While microwaves were not common in every home initially, the advice anticipated growing appliance use. The damp paper towel method remains a handy tip for anyone wanting to quickly refresh bread without fuss. Making buttermilk substitute with vinegar or lemon juice was a widely used shortcut in mid-century American kitchens when buttermilk was not always readily available or affordable. This simple trick involved adding 1 tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice to a cup of regular milk and letting it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. The acid in the vinegar or lemon juice curdled the milk slightly, mimicking the tangy flavor and thicker consistency of buttermilk. This substitute worked well in recipes such as pancakes, biscuits, and cakes, where buttermilk's acidity was necessary to react with baking soda for leavening. Betty Crocker's cookbooks embraced this hack for its practicality, helping home cooks achieve consistent results without needing specialty ingredients. The trick saved time and money, reducing trips to the store and preventing spoiled buttermilk from going to waste. This approach reflected the resourcefulness encouraged in the post-war era, where adaptability in the kitchen was valued. It remains a trusted method today for anyone needing a quick buttermilk replacement. Using wax paper to separate layers of cookies for freezing was a clever freezing hack that preserved freshness and prevented sticking, a common issue in mid-century home baking. This technique involved placing sheets of wax paper between stacked cookies before wrapping or placing them in airtight containers or freezer bags. The wax paper acted as a barrier, stopping the cookies from clumping together and keeping their shapes intact during freezing and thawing. Betty Crocker's cookbooks recommended this method to extend the shelf life of homemade baked goods and maintain their texture. This simple step saved bakers time and frustration by avoiding broken or misshapen cookies after storage. The hack fit well with the era's focus on food preservation and minimizing waste, especially important when ingredients and time were limited. Wax paper separation also facilitated easy portioning and thawing of individual cookies, making snacks or desserts convenient to enjoy later. This tip remains popular today among bakers aiming to keep their frozen treats fresh and intact. Adding a pinch of salt to sweet pie fillings was a subtle seasoning tip that Betty Crocker's cookbooks shared to balance and brighten dessert flavors. While salt is often associated with savory dishes, its inclusion in fruit or custard fillings enhanced the overall taste by cutting through sweetness and amplifying natural flavors. This small amount of salt helped prevent the dessert from tasting overly sugary or one-dimensional. It was especially effective in pies featuring apples, berries, or pumpkins, where a touch of salt brought out depth and complexity. The trick encouraged home bakers to think beyond basic sweetness and embrace flavor layering. This technique reflected mid-century culinary wisdom that even simple ingredients could be used strategically to improve results. Adding salt to sweet fillings became a hallmark of thoughtful dessert preparation, elevating humble pies to memorable treats. The tip remains a valuable lesson for modern cooks seeking balanced and nuanced sweets. Cooling cake layers in the refrigerator to prevent crumbling was a technique promoted in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to make frosting application easier and keep cakes intact. After baking and initial cooling, cake layers were wrapped or covered and placed in the refrigerator until firm. This chilling step helped stabilize the crumb structure, reducing the risk of the cake breaking or crumbling during frosting or stacking. It also made the layers easier to handle, allowing for cleaner cuts and smoother assembly. The method was especially useful for delicate or thin cake layers that tended to be fragile. This tip reflected mid-century cooks' desire to achieve polished, professional-looking cakes at home without expensive equipment. Chilling before frosting contributed to better texture and appearance, helping desserts maintain their shape and elegance for serving. Cooling cake layers remains a common baking practice, demonstrating how patience and simple steps can elevate homemade cakes to bakery quality. Using a fork and hot water to easily peel hard-boiled eggs was a handy tip that saved time and effort in the kitchen. This technique involved gently tapping and cracking the shell, then dipping the egg in hot water while using a fork to loosen the shell's membrane. The warm water softened the membrane, making it easier to remove large pieces of shell without sticking to the egg white. This trick minimized frustration from stubborn shells and ensured cleaner, more presentable eggs for salads, deviled eggs, or snacks. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this tip highlighted practical kitchen shortcuts that improved cooking efficiency. It was especially useful when peeling multiple eggs quickly was necessary, such as during holiday gatherings or batch meal preparation. The method demonstrated the mid-century emphasis on clever yet simple solutions for common cooking challenges. Using hot water and a fork for peeling remains a popular trick today among home cooks seeking quick, mess-free results. Making fluffy rice by adding a pat of butter before serving was a finishing touch that added richness and enhanced flavor to simple steamed or boiled rice. This technique, recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks, involved stirring in butter just before serving to coat the grains, giving the rice a glossy appearance and a smooth, buttery taste. The addition of butter elevated plain rice from a basic side dish to a comforting accompaniment suitable for a variety of meals. This simple step also helped prevent the rice from clumping together, improving texture and appeal. The tip reflected mid-century home cooks' desire to make everyday dishes more enjoyable with minimal effort. Buttered rice fit well with the era's emphasis on richness and indulgence in family meals, especially when other ingredients were modest. This finishing touch continues to be a beloved way to prepare rice, combining ease and flavor in classic American cooking. Using a coffee filter to strain broth or sauces was an innovative technique promoted in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to clarify liquids and achieve smooth textures. This method involved pouring warm broth, stock, or sauces through a coffee filter placed over a bowl or pot, which caught fine particles, impurities, and sediment. The result was a clear, clean-tasting liquid free of cloudiness or unwanted bits. This technique was especially useful for homemade stocks or gravies, where a refined appearance was desired for elegant presentation. Betty Crocker's recommendation of coffee filters as an accessible kitchen tool showcased creative problem-solving without requiring specialized equipment. This trick fit well with the mid-century emphasis on presentation and quality in home cooking. It enabled home cooks to produce restaurant-style dishes with minimal hassle. Using coffee filters for straining remains a clever and practical tip for cooks aiming to perfect the clarity and texture of their liquids. Reviving wilted lettuce with cold water and a pinch of sugar was a refreshing trick from Betty Crocker's cookbooks to freshen salad greens before serving. The method involved soaking limp lettuce leaves in a bowl of ice-cold water with a small amount of sugar added to the water. The sugar helped to restore crispness and improve flavor, while the cold water rehydrated the leaves, making them firm and appetizing again. This technique was especially useful when lettuce had been stored too long or was slightly past its prime. Reviving greens in this way allowed cooks to reduce waste and ensure salads looked fresh and inviting. The trick reflected the mid-century home cook's resourcefulness and desire to maximize ingredient usability. It also emphasized the importance of texture and presentation in everyday meals. The cold water and sugar soak remains a popular method for restoring crispness to leafy greens in kitchens today. Using a pastry blender for quick biscuit dough mixing was a time-saving technique recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to achieve tender, flaky biscuits with ease. The tool helped cut cold butter or shortening into flour quickly and evenly, creating small, fat pockets essential for flaky layers in the baked biscuit. Using a pastry blender reduced the effort and mess compared to mixing by hand or with forks, making the process more efficient and accessible. This method was favored in mid-century kitchens where homemade biscuits were a breakfast staple or accompaniment to meals. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this tool in her cookbooks reflected the growing availability of specialized kitchen gadgets designed to simplify cooking tasks. The pastry blender helped home bakers achieve consistent biscuit textures, elevating everyday baking. This technique remains a fundamental tip for anyone wanting perfectly flaky biscuits without hassle. Keeping cut apples from browning by soaking in salted water was a practical tip from Betty Crocker's cookbooks to maintain fresh-looking fruit slices. After cutting, apple slices were soaked briefly in cold water with a small amount of salt dissolved in it, which slowed the enzymatic browning process that causes discoloration. This method preserved the appealing color and crispness of apples, making them more attractive for serving in salads, snacks, or lunchboxes. The slight saltiness did not affect the flavor noticeably when done correctly, and the slices could be rinsed afterward if desired. This trick was especially useful for preparing fruit ahead of time or for gatherings where presentation mattered. Betty Crocker's advice demonstrated an understanding of both the science and practicality behind food preparation. The salted water soak remains a widely used kitchen hack for anyone wanting to keep apples fresh and visually appealing. Microwaving butter wrapped in parchment for even melting was a clever method shared in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to ensure butter melted smoothly without separating or overheating. This technique involved wrapping a stick or portion of butter in parchment paper before placing it in the microwave for short intervals. The parchment protected the butter from direct heat, allowing it to soften evenly and preventing the fats from separating, which often happened when butter was microwaved unwrapped. This method saved time compared to melting butter on the stove while maintaining ideal texture for baking or cooking. It was especially useful in mid-century kitchens where efficiency and precision were valued. By using parchment, home cooks avoided the mess and uneven results of traditional melting methods. This trick reflected the era's increasing use of microwaves and new kitchen materials to improve everyday cooking. It remains a handy tip for modern cooks seeking quick, reliable butter melting without sacrificing quality. Using waxed paper to roll out pie dough without sticking was a simple hack that made dough handling and transfer easier for home bakers. This method involved placing the dough between 2 sheets of waxed paper before rolling, preventing it from sticking to the rolling pin or work surface. The waxed paper acted as a non-stick barrier, reducing flour use and keeping the dough moist and pliable. Once rolled out, the dough could be easily lifted and transferred to pie pans without tearing or stretching. Betty Crocker's cookbooks promoted this technique as a way to reduce frustration and mess in mid-century kitchens, especially for novice bakers. The hack improved the overall pie-making process, resulting in better-shaped crusts and less wasted dough. It reflected the period's focus on practical solutions that saved time and improved results in home cooking. Using waxed paper for rolling dough remains a trusted tip for bakers aiming for perfect pastries. Adding instant potato flakes to thicken soups and sauces was a convenient shortcut, common in mid-century kitchens that simplified thickening without the need for flour or roux. This technique involved sprinkling dehydrated potato flakes into hot liquids to quickly achieve the desired consistency. The flakes absorbed liquid rapidly, thickening broths and gravies while adding a subtle, creamy texture. Betty Crocker's cookbooks recommended this method for its speed and ease, especially when time or ingredients were limited. It allowed cooks to rescue thin or watery dishes without extra cooking steps. This shortcut fit well with the era's emphasis on efficiency and resourcefulness in meal preparation. Using instant potato flakes also provided a gluten-free thickening alternative before awareness of dietary restrictions became widespread. This technique remains useful for cooks who want fast, reliable results when thickening soups or sauces. Using a toothpick to test cake doneness without drying it out was a gentle and effective way Betty Crocker's cookbooks taught home bakers to check baking progress. Instead of inserting the toothpick deeply, the recommendation was to lightly touch the center of the cake with the tip and remove it quickly. If the toothpick came out clean or with a few moist crumbs, the cake was done. This method avoided overtesting and minimized heat loss or drying caused by repeatedly opening the oven or poking too deeply. It helped bakers achieve perfectly baked cakes with moist interiors and well-set textures. The technique reflected mid-century baking wisdom emphasizing precision and care. Using a toothpick remained a simple, mess-free diagnostic tool that gave confidence to home cooks. It continues to be a trusted method for checking doneness without compromising cake quality. Freezing leftover coffee to use as ice cubes for iced coffee was a neat trick from Betty Crocker's cookbooks that allowed people to chill drinks without diluting flavor. Instead of using regular ice, which melted and watered down the coffee, Leftover brewed coffee was poured into trays and frozen. These coffee ice cubes could then be added to iced coffee beverages, keeping them cold while preserving the full coffee taste. This method was perfect for the mid-century era's growing enthusiasm for cold coffee drinks and practical use of leftovers. It helped reduce waste and improved the enjoyment of homemade iced coffee, especially during warmer months. Betty Crocker's recommendation showed attention to both flavor and economy in the kitchen. Using coffee ice cubes remains a clever, popular technique among coffee enthusiasts who want a stronger, less diluted drink. Using parchment paper to line cake pans for easy removal was a baking tip that improved cleanup and presentation in mid-century home kitchens. By cutting parchment to fit the bottom of cake pans, bakers ensured that cakes could be lifted out effortlessly without sticking or breaking. This technique reduced the risk of cracked or torn cake layers, allowing for neater frosting and stacking. Additionally, it saved time on cleaning, as pans required less scrubbing and washing. Betty Crocker's cookbooks promoted this method as a simple step that elevated homemade baking results. It was especially useful for delicate cakes or those with sticky batters. Lining pans with parchment reflected the period's growing focus on technique and presentation in home baking. The tip remains standard practice today, helping bakers achieve professional quality cakes with ease. Adding a dash of coffee to chocolate cake batter for richer flavor was a subtle but impactful flavor enhancer included in Betty Crocker's cookbooks. This trick involves stirring a small amount of brewed coffee or instant coffee granules into the chocolate cake batter, deepening the chocolate taste without overpowering it. The coffee intensified the cocoa's richness, producing a more complex and satisfying flavor profile. This tip was especially valuable when using cocoa powders that could be mild or flat in taste. It reflected the mid-century interest in maximizing flavors through simple ingredient tweaks. The coffee addition elevated a classic dessert into something memorable, delighting both casual and discerning eaters. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this hack encouraged experimentation and attention to detail in baking. This method remains a favorite for bakers seeking to amplify their chocolate cakes with a subtle twist. Warming dinner rolls in a towel-wrapped basket to keep them soft was a presentation and freshness tip that enhanced family meals in mid-century America. This method involved placing freshly baked or warmed rolls inside a basket lined with a clean kitchen towel, which was then folded over to cover the bread. The towel helped trap heat and moisture, preventing the rolls from drying out or becoming crusty too quickly. Serving rolls this way kept them soft and inviting at the table, complementing hearty dinners and encouraging communal eating. Betty Crocker's cookbooks recommended this technique to elevate the dining experience with minimal effort. The approach combined practicality with a touch of hospitality, reflecting mid-century values around family meals and comfort. This warming method remains popular today for keeping bread fresh and appealing during gatherings. Tying herb bundles with cheesecloth for easy removal from soups was a practical trick Betty Crocker's cookbooks shared to infuse flavor without leaving behind leaves or stems. This involved gathering fresh herbs like thyme, parsley, or bay leaves into a small bundle, securing them with cheesecloth or kitchen twine before adding to simmering soups or stocks. The bundle released aromatic oils and flavors during cooking, but could be easily removed in one piece, simplifying cleanup and preventing bits from floating in the finished dish. This method ensured consistent flavor without sacrificing presentation or texture. It reflected mid-century cooking's growing sophistication and attention to detail in home kitchens. Using herb bundles made flavorful soups more accessible and enjoyable for families. This technique remains a staple in modern cooking for efficiently imparting herbaceous notes without fuss. Cooling cookies on wire racks to prevent soggy bottoms was an important baking step Betty Crocker's cookbooks emphasized to preserve cookie texture. After removing cookies from the oven, placing them on wire racks allowed air to circulate freely around all sides, helping the cookies cool evenly and retain their crispness. Without this step, cookies left on baking sheets could trap steam underneath, causing soft or soggy bottoms. This cooling technique was essential for achieving the ideal balance between a crisp exterior and tender interior. Betty Crocker's advice reflected a meticulous approach to baking that helped home cooks perfect their results. Wire rack cooling became a standard practice in mid-century kitchens and remains critical for bakers today. This simple step ensured cookies kept their intended texture, contributing to their overall enjoyment and appeal. Canning leftover fruit juices into jellies without pectin was a homemade preservation trick popular before commercial pectins were widely available. Home cooks would collect juices from cooked fruits like apples, berries, or grapes and boil them with sugar until the mixture naturally thickened and set into jelly form. This process relied on the natural pectin content of the fruit or slow reduction to achieve the right consistency. Betty Crocker encouraged such resourceful methods to reduce waste and extend the use of precious fruit harvests, especially during the Depression and wartime. Families could preserve seasonal flavors in jars, creating sweet spreads that lasted months without refrigeration. This hands-on method required patience and careful temperature control, making it a prized skill among home canners. Though commercial pectins simplified jelly making later on, the traditional technique held a charm and authenticity that many modern cooks now seek to revive. It represents a time when food preservation was as much art as science. So, putting your fruits in sugar to preserve them is an age-old trick that's been around forever. Are you interested in the know-how, though? Because it's actually a lot of neat little stuff working together to make sure you can get 1 or 2 days more out of that banana. So, first, we need to talk about a little something called osmotic pressure. Sugar tends to make an environment with a high amount of osmotic pressure, and this really draws water out of microbial cells, which includes things like bacteria and yeast. Microbes basically need their daily 8 glasses of water to live, or they'll die, and unlike us, they can't substitute that for a Coke and a cigarette. Sugar binds with molecules in water, and it robs those microorganisms of what they need to live. Pretty brutal, right? That's not sweet at all. I bet you didn't know how much sugar reduces it either, and your overall water activity actually goes below 0.85 plus. It also works as an antioxidant. What does that mean? Basically, the enzymes that are responsible for browning your fruit, ruining that perfectly ripe taste? Sugar gets rid of that. All in all, it's your go-to solution for making your fruits last longer, look better, and taste fresher also? Just be cleaner overall. Really just a pit stop for your fruit basket. Making fruit leather with nothing but the sun and a flat rock was the perfect way to capture summer's sweetness for the long, hungry months ahead. Native American cooks would mash wild berries, apples, or plums into thick, pulpy pastes and spread them carefully over flat, sun-warmed stones. Covered lightly with woven grasses or bark to keep pests away, the fruit would dry slowly under the open sky, concentrating into chewy, intensely flavored strips packed with vitamins and natural sugars. These homemade fruit leathers were not just snacks. They were essential travel rations, dessert after lean meals, and precious gifts given between families and tribes. And while these sweet creations came from the land's generosity, another treasure was pulled from its hidden places too, one that changed cooking, trade, and survival forever: the gathering of salt from natural licks deep in the wild. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine, it was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Using gelatin to thicken sauces without lumps was a classic Betty Crocker trick that brought a silky smooth finish to gravies and desserts alike. Unlike modern methods that often rely on flour or cornstarch, This approach involved dissolving gelatin gently in a small amount of cold water before gradually adding it to warm sauces. This prevented any clumping, leaving behind a glossy texture that elevated even the simplest dishes. It was a reliable technique, especially during times when flour could be scarce or when cooks wanted a clear sauce rather than a cloudy one. Home cooks treasured this tip because it was easy, effective, and made their meals look as good as they tasted. Though it faded with time as convenience cooking took over, this gelatin method is still valuable today for those who want restaurant-quality results at home. Many forget that gelatin is a powerful thickening agent beyond desserts, and Betty Crocker was one of the first to bring this knowledge into the average kitchen. Reintroducing this trick could transform your sauces from ordinary to extraordinary, without the hassle of lumps or heavy flour flavors. Before the days of freezers and two-door fridges, we had cold cellars, which you may also have heard being referred to as root cellars. For centuries, this was pretty much the cornerstone of not just America, but global society as a whole on how to preserve their food. Why was that, though? Most modern freezers actually try to replicate the environments people had in cold cellars. The temperatures you'd find in these frosty rooms would go down to 30 degrees and 50 degrees, and that meant that enzymatic activity, the same thing we just discussed that browns your bananas bad, goes down heavily in vegetables and fruits. Cold temperatures basically do the same for microbes too. Stunted growth is bad for anyone, not just kids that don't drink their milk. Plus, cold cellars have really high levels of humidity. Moisture retention is a big deal for these things, you know. You don't give them enough of that, they're liable to die way before they need to. Yet you've also heard that too much of the stuff is bad for you. You've probably heard your parents say not to keep your apples too close or around too much air, or keep your onions separate. Well, that's because of ethylene gas. With too much moisture and not enough ventilation, the buildup of this gas and the release of it causes a lot of nasty cross-contamination. Basically, you don't want your fruits being bad neighbors, and cold cellars were such a nice neighborhood too. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself, and if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Using a cold water soak to reduce salt in cured meats was an old trick to rescue too salty leftovers and make them more enjoyable. If bacon, ham, or salted pork had been over-cured or stored too long, home cooks would soak the slices in cold water for several hours or overnight. This process helped draw out excess salt, mellowing the flavor without sacrificing the meat's texture or usefulness. Betty Crocker's guides promoted this method as a cost-saving measure that allowed families to stretch their food supply and avoid waste. It was especially helpful in eras when purchasing fresh meat was a challenge or expensive. This soaking trick balanced strong saltiness while maintaining the rich flavor characteristic of cured meats. Today, many have forgotten this straightforward fix, but it remains a practical solution for those dealing with saltier than desired products. You've heard this one 1,000 times before, and for good reason too. People dry their herbs because it's simply one of the best, oldest, and most effective ways of removing any excess moisture, keeping all that icky, bacterial nonsense off of your herbs, and making sure that your greens last as long as you need them to. You're here for the why, though, and that's what I'm here to answer for you. When you dry herbs, you reduce their overall water content. As we've discussed already, a bunch of harmful bacteria and microorganisms desperately need water and air to survive, and in that regard, they're really not so different from us. Volatile oils, on the other hand, are what give herbs and aromatics their flavor and scents. This is why you've probably heard folk tips, such as boiling herbs to clear out odors. High temperatures cause these essentials to leak out, so the opposite, which in this case is proper drying, actually helps maintain these oils in the herbs, sealing all that flavor and fragrance in. In Native American traditions, their herbalists used to dry herbs to ensure that treatments, ointments, medicinal balms, and herb-based remedies were available to the community all year round. Yarrow and chamomile, for example, were and still are big-time staples of household remedies. During World War II, these practices were adopted by the mainstream to help victory gardens provide more produce that would last longer as well. So, it might be a basic trick, but it's got a lot of benefits and history behind it. Clay-coated meats were one of the most astonishing ways Native American cooks sealed in moisture, flavor, and nutrients without a single modern tool. Fresh game was coated in thick, wet clay, sometimes along with a layer of leaves or bark, then buried directly in hot coals or ash. As the clay baked hard around the meat, it formed a natural oven, trapping the juices inside and allowing the food to steam slowly in its own rich flavors. When the clay was finally cracked open, the aroma would hit you first, deep, smoky, and primal. It was cooking stripped down to its purest, most beautiful form. And even as the meat roasted and absorbed the earth's gifts, native chefs had another breathtaking trick, turning simple berry juice into smoking cloths that kissed their foods with a sweetness no store-bought glaze could ever match. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating river stones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. Wrapping butter in wax paper for easier spreading was a practical tip that made cold butter easier to work with before the age of microwaves. Betty Crocker taught that wrapping sticks or blocks of butter tightly in wax paper and storing them in the fridge made the butter softer and easier to slice or spread directly on bread. The wax paper prevented the butter from absorbing unwanted fridge smells and also made it easy to unwrap small amounts without messy fingers. This was an important daily convenience for home cooks, especially when refrigeration was colder and butter was firmer than today. The tip helped keep butter fresh and ready for use while avoiding waste or spoilage. In modern kitchens, butter is often softened on the counter or melted, but this classic wrapping method remains an elegant solution for maintaining butter's best texture and flavor. So, no one's a stranger to the process of larding. but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work, though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook. But when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty-smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too, though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. Spicing meat with wild juniper and sage instead of store-bought seasonings was a mark of true culinary craftsmanship long before organic became a buzzword. Juniper berries with their sharp piney taste and sage leaves with their deep, smoky aroma were easy to find across wide swaths of native lands, and together they created one of the oldest and most unforgettable flavor combinations known to man. Hunters would rub juniper directly onto fresh meat before roasting it over fires, allowing the resins to seep into the flesh and protect it from bacteria while infusing it with mouth-watering flavor. Sage was burned, brewed, and crushed into spice blends that transformed even the toughest game meats into savory, aromatic feasts. And just when you think seasoning meat could not get any more poetic, native chefs took it one step further, discovering a way to use wild berries not just as food, but as a way to glaze and preserve fish in the most mouth-watering way imaginable. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Soaking celery in ice water to restore crispness was a simple but ingenious fridge hack that helped vintage kitchens keep their produce fresh and crunchy longer. Celery often loses its crunch quickly, especially when stored improperly or left out too long. Betty Crocker recommended soaking the celery stalks in a bowl of ice water for about an hour before use, which would revitalize wilted celery by rehydrating the cells and firming up the texture. This was an essential trick for home cooks who relied heavily on fresh vegetables in their salads and soups, but did not have access to refrigeration as efficient as today's models. The crisp celery made every meal feel fresher and more satisfying, preventing waste in households where every bit of food mattered. This quick refresh technique was widely taught in community cookbooks and cooking classes, but over time, people forgot the simple power of ice water for produce. Rediscovering this trick can save money and add that needed snap to your dishes. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Again, with wax sealing jars, the same thing holds true. An age-old concept that was actually far ahead of its time. It's all just a pretty clever use of the natural properties of these things, really. Wax forms a barrier between air and your food, and that means you don't have to worry about any airborne contamination or any bacteria getting the air they need to survive. Plus, what a lot of people would do is melt the wax and pour it over the food. Cold isn't the only thing you can trap inside things like ice houses. You can do the same to heat in things like melted wax. Not only would this sterilize the wax, it would kill off most bacteria on the surface of the jar too. There were loads of cultural traditions around farm families that basically let them use wax jars as much as they could, alongside a strong artistic appeal. Some people would use specialty wax jars for high-quality jams, honey, or other kinds of gourmet products. In the 70s, there was kind of a return for things like this, but they couldn't keep up with modern technology, so they eventually were left behind once again. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Making frosted glass jars to store leftovers was a clever way to keep food fresher longer using everyday kitchen supplies. Before airtight plastic containers became commonplace, Betty Crocker's guide suggested frosting glass jars with a layer of wax paper or parchment on the inside to create a moisture barrier. This helped prevent leftover foods from drying out or absorbing unwanted odors in the fridge. The slightly frosted surface also reduced condensation buildup, which was a major cause of early spoilage in cold storage. This method was especially popular during wartime rationing and the Depression, when stretching meals and saving leftovers was critical. Housewives took pride in preserving food quality as long as possible, and this little trick gave their meals a second life without needing special containers. Today, with plastic everywhere, this elegant and eco-friendly solution is often overlooked. Bringing it back not only saves money but also adds a nostalgic charm to food storage. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrates break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. Maple sap water, the original sweet cooking liquid, was one of nature's purest gifts and one that Native American communities mastered long before the first colonists ever set foot in North America. In early spring, when the nights were still cold but the days warmed just enough, sap would begin to flow through the veins of maple trees. Native foragers would tap these trees carefully, gathering the clear, slightly sweet liquid that poured out. It was not yet the thick, sticky syrup we think of today. Instead, it was a crisp, refreshing, faintly sweet water that could be drunk straight or used to cook rice, stew, or even brew lightweight, revitalizing teas. To drink maple sap water was to drink hope after a brutal winter. But as delicious as maple was, native chefs had another dark, overlooked ingredient that added both flavor and unexpected health benefits to their meals. And it came straight from the heart of the fire itself. Using charcoal powder to enhance meat flavor and aid digestion sounds almost too wild to be real, but for Native American cooks, it was a smart, practical tool built from hard-earned wisdom. After a fire burned down to pure white coals, small amounts of fine charcoal powder were sometimes sprinkled over cooking meats or even mixed into marinades. The charcoal acted as a natural purifier, absorbing toxins and helping break down tough fibers inside the meat, making it not only more flavorful but also easier on the stomach. Some healers even mixed tiny amounts into drinking water after big meals, trusting charcoal's natural ability to soothe digestion and guard against sickness. It tasted like the earth, the fire, and the sky, all wrapped up into one unforgettable bite. And if you thought using charcoal was clever, wait until you hear about how deer fat candles turned slow basting into an art form that even today's chefs can barely rival. On the other hand, pemmican is a traditional food developed by indigenous peoples of North America. They were a very ideal way to preserve meat, fat, and berries all in one for long-term storage, and it's probably one of the earliest examples we have of portable food that was put in a compact form because it needed to. It was ideal for travel, trading, and quick consumption, all factors that American industries and companies would keep in mind going forward. How does all this work, though? Bison, deer, and elk are all good sources of lean meat and were herded by indigenous peoples for a long time. All the meat from these animals would be dried, either through sun-drying it or through smoking it. In place of that, rendered fat like tallow would be mixed with the powdered dried meat, and this would seal the meat, preventing any air from interacting with it and excess moisture ruining the drying process. Berries also would contain acidic compounds and antioxidants that would help kill microbe activity overall and help reduce spoilage, and the final mix of this would be molded into cakes and balls and put into compact containers. If you made pemmican properly, it could actually last all year or even more than that, and it was packed with all kinds of nutrition that were important for a nomadic lifestyle. In short, this was a wonder food, and it was built to take care of everything you would need nutritionally. How to soften brown sugar with a slice of bread was an old but incredibly effective method to fix hardened sugar that saved countless cooks from frustration. Brown sugar, with its natural molasses content, tends to dry out and form solid lumps when left exposed to air. Betty Crocker recommended placing a slice of fresh bread in the container with the sugar and sealing it tight for a day or two. The moisture from the bread would transfer to the sugar, restoring its soft, crumbly texture without damaging flavor. This simple kitchen hack meant no waste and no need to buy new sugar, which was particularly important during rationing periods. It was a household secret passed down through generations and featured in many mid-century cookbooks. Today, people might reach for microwaves or commercial softening products, but the bread trick remains an all-natural, cost-free solution that really works. It also teaches patience and resourcefulness in the kitchen. Using charcoal powder to enhance meat flavor and aid digestion sounds almost too wild to be real, but for Native American cooks, it was a smart, practical tool built from hard-earned wisdom. After a fire burned down to pure white coals, small amounts of fine charcoal powder were sometimes sprinkled over cooking meats or even mixed into marinades. The charcoal acted as a natural purifier, absorbing toxins and helping break down tough fibers inside the meat, making it not only more flavorful but also easier on the stomach. Some healers even mix tiny amounts into drinking water after big meals, trusting charcoal's natural ability to soothe digestion and guard against sickness. It tasted like the earth, the fire, and the sky, all wrapped up into one unforgettable bite. And if you thought using charcoal was clever, wait until you hear about how deer fat candles turned slow basting into an art form that even today's chefs can barely rival. Which cooking trick will you try first? Comment below, like the video, and subscribe for more timeless tips.